For over half a century, Canada has been a world leader in the production, use, and development of life-saving medical isotopes. The world is counting on Canada to expand this leadership role to support the diagnosis and treatment of cancer, ensuring medical equipment is safe for use, and to tackle some of our greatest challenges in health sciences. Welcome to the Canadian Nuclear Isotope Council's Isotopes for Hope podcast with your host, James Skoniak, Chair of the CNIC. In this series, we interview Canadian leaders who are making a difference every day. We hope you enjoy this episode of the Isotopes for Hope podcast.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us today on our Isotopes for Hope podcast. And what's very special about today's podcast is we are broadcasting it from the Canadian Theranostics Leadership Summit here at the Mars Discovery Centre in downtown Toronto. And this is a partnership between the Canadian Nuclear Isotope Council, most importantly UHN, who's really the leader and the driver behind this, and the Canadian Medical Isotope ecosystem. And I'm really thrilled today to have two outstanding individuals with me today, Dr. Rebecca Wong and Dr. Patrick Veit-Haibach. It's great to have you both with us. I do want to tell you about these individuals because they are just amazing people. Patrick is a dual certified radiologist and nuclear medicine physician, currently serving as the deputy radiologist in chief and PET MR program division at the Joint Department Medical Imaging in Toronto, Canada. That is a long title, but what I take from that is you do a lot of very important work for patients and who are dealing with cancer and other issues. He's a full professor of radiology and nuclear medicine at the Department of Medical Imaging at U of T. And he has just an amazing, long-standing career. We could probably fill the whole podcast with his bio. But in particular, he's published over 240 articles, multiple book chapters, and has been the editor and co-editor of 4 books in molecular hybrid imaging. So I really want to thank Patrick for joining us today. And Rebecca, who's somebody that I've got to know over the years. She's a radiation oncologist at Princess Margaret Hospital, a professor at the Department of Radiation Oncology at the University of Toronto, and has a very extensive background and resume. But in particular, she's been really instrumental in terms of working with the Canadian Nuclear Isotope Council, UHN, and a lot of these partners over the number of years to bring this whole industry together. And what I can say is, I mentioned this at the kickoff to and I appreciate you welcoming me this morning, that there's so much important work that goes on in your institution. And as an Ontarian, as somebody who has unfortunately had to be and family had to be a user of what you do every day, it's so important. And so I just want to start by just saying thank you for being here, and quite genuinely thank you for what you do. What I really want to talk about today is we've had a lot of focus in the Isotopes for Hope podcast on Canada's unique position in this, in terms of the production of isotopes and our Isotopes for Hope campaign to double isotope production by 2030. But I'll start with you, Patrick. And obviously somebody has a real global perspective on this, leader in your field. Sometimes I don't think people out there who are not in your field, there's not a full understanding of just the opportunity that there is in theranostics and radiopharmaceuticals. So you start us with a bit of a global picture on, as I use a Canadian hockey analogy, where the puck is going here. Talk to us about the field and how it's growing.
So thank you, first of all, for welcoming me here on the podcast. I think it's great to be here. And so where's the puck going? I'm not a hockey person. So being from Europe, I was mostly into soccer, obviously.
So where's the soccer ball going?
Where's the soccer ball going? Goes towards the goal always, obviously. So in terms of when we look back a little bit, when thyroid therapies, right? Everybody was sitting on this, and nobody thought this was going anywhere, right? We had it; it was functioning very well, and there were nothing new really coming into the field for quite a while. But in the last 10 to 15 years, I would say, a lot of new molecules have been brought out of the labs, out of the radiopharmaceutical or radiopharmacies into the industry, into the market. We see a lot of engagement from pharma industry, from other industries, for example, in the radiotheranostics field. So where is the soccer ball in this field going? I think a lot of targets which are currently being in phase 1, 2, 3 studies.
Yeah.
They are currently being evaluated. Not all of them will make it. I think we discussed it with other colleagues this morning. I think we are currently in a kind of maybe something like a little bit of a nuclear medicine radioligand bubble, if you want to call it that way. So there's a lot of excitement, and not all the indications will make it. But I think there's so much excitement that there will be a significant proportion of these compounds and radiopharmaceuticals which are currently being evaluated, which will make it into clinical routine in different indications, right? So we have obviously prostate cancer, we have neuroendocrine tumors, right, but there are several others already on the horizon, whether it's brain tumors, whether it's pancreatic cancer, whether it's breast cancer, lung cancer. All of these cancers are already in trials being investigated. So there will be a lot more of these indications coming through, and a lot more of these tumors will be actually treated in certain settings, not in all of them, but in certain settings with radioligand therapy. That's for sure.
No, that's a helpful perspective, and maybe just before we go to Rebecca, maybe just to build on that perspective, which I think is great. As we think about this from a Canadian perspective, in terms of what we should be focused on, because as you say, some things will materialize, some things won't. That's the world they're in. What would your advice be to sort of the broader Canadian ecosystem, policymakers, forums like this, in terms of where our focus should be?
I think the focus should be from a Canadian perspective, is to strengthen actually the sector, because the infrastructure is already there, right? So there is the production sector is already available, is already there, and has a long-standing history already in Canada and Ontario, whereas other countries are pulling out of that infrastructure and out of this industry. For example, I think there's a huge opportunity for Ontario and Canada to stay in that industry, because it's currently growing significantly and at a very fast pace. Also to invest and to make it easy to invest in along the production and supply chain, for example, for those industries. So I think this is really an industry which will thrive if the infrastructure and the policies around this infrastructure is actually made up for success.
So Rebecca, over to you now. So I hate to admit this, but I didn't know what theranostics was until we met. I'd always heard a lot about diagnostics, and I heard a lot about therapeutics, but this whole area of theranostics was very new to me. Where I came from, we were focused on the production of cobalt-60 for sterilization and for, as you know, through the gamma knife and the gamma pod, brain tumors and breast cancer. And when I first met you was when I really think a lot of the dialogue around theranostics was starting to emerge. So for some of our listeners who may be kind of tuning into this for the first time, can you explain what does theranostics mean? How should we think of theranostics now and in the future versus what our traditional thinking has been?
So theranostics is a play of the word of diagnostic and therapy. And basically, theranostic is the use of a designer drug that has the ability to be used for diagnosis as well as treatment of cancers. So the construct of a radiotheranostic pharmaceutical is basically involving a radioisotope with a key, if you will, that will seek out special markers on cells. And by designing the key to look for these markers, we can bind them. And by changing the radioisotope, when the weaker ones will just be like a light bulb to show up where the cancers or the abnormal cells are, whereas the stronger radioisotope, stronger as in the energy that it emits, can be used to damage the cells and therefore shrinks the tumor and improve patient outcome. What makes this field really exciting is the blossoming of molecular markers that we are able to identify. So we hear about HER2 receptors, EGFR, and many more that the science community is able to identify that characterize certain cancers. So, and we can design these designer drugs to attack these and find these cancer cells, these markers, and therefore treat them and damage them while sparing the normal tissues that do not overexpress these receptors. So that's the beauty of this treatment.
So one of the areas we've talked a lot about on previous podcasts with ITM, a German-based company, I know they're here today as part of your conference. Isogen and Bruce Power is the production of lutetium. Right now, I know the primary focus of lutetium is on prostate cancer and neuroendocrine tumors. Obviously, you can't predict the future, but can you share with us your perspective on how the use of lutetium could grow to and expand to other types of treatments?
So lutetium is really the payload. So it's the key that we are going to be able to modify to seek out different targets. So even the tools that we currently have that targets prostate cancer and neuroendocrine tumor, it can target other cancers. These markers that are overexpressed in neuroendocrine tumor, for example, is also overexpressed in glioblastoma, certain types of lung cancer, and trials are beginning to be conducted applying these established radiopharmaceutical in these other diseases. Now, of course, there are other drugs that are being designed to target other molecular markers as well as changing the radioisotope to emit even more powerful radiation, such as actinium-225, which is a very popular one that is being studied right now. Most of these studies are being designed, and rightly so, for patients with advanced metastatic disease. That's how cancer studies emerge. We use it in patients that don't have a lot of other options,
right,
and establish this efficacy. The next step is to move this up in the trajectory of the cancer pathway, so that now we have studies that are looking at patients that have higher risk disease, but does not have metastatic disease yet, and look for its potential benefit. Patients who have some small amount of metastatic disease and maybe seeking to cure them as well as rather than just controlling the disease. The next step that we really look forward to is how to best combine it with existing cancer tools. With immunotherapy is an exciting one, with radiotherapy surgery. So there are lots of opportunities to use this tool to fight cancers.
Well, that's great. And to maybe build on that, and Patrick, I thought you recently participated on a panel at the Toronto Region Board of Trade, and I was really, your presentation had an impact on me, and I really want to kind of build on the picture that you really painted at that breakfast, and think about it from the perspective of public policy. So here we have, I think, very strong support from the national government, the government of Canada, the government of Ontario. We have municipalities, regions. We have First Nations communities here. And shifting this to a public policy discussion, because we can't do any of this without strong public policy. What would be your message for policymakers on what they should be focused on in terms of enabling the success that people like you and Rebecca drive every day?
Well, my advice is maybe a little bit of a strong word, right, to advise policymakers, but what I would think would get us success in enabling these therapies is that and that was discussed this morning a little bit already, that we are not waiting necessarily for, I don't know how many multi-center and multinational trials to arise and then replicate this data locally as well. I think it would be reasonable from a medical perspective, for example, to say, okay, we have from other jurisdictions, we have that data, it's reasonable data, it's very well-made data, we can take that in our Ontario context and in our Canadian context and provide access to those therapies, which have been proven to be successful and effective in other jurisdictions as well. So I would think that it's not always necessary to replicate the same data over and over again in your own context, for example. So that would be one thing which makes it easier. And also, I think more of, and I know that's a complicated topic because as physicians, we are all busy. We are not necessarily have the time always to sit in the policymaker's office to discuss with them. But again, a little bit more from our side, for example, and also from the physician side and also from the policymaker side to have like venues to come together to discuss these topics so that everybody understands really what are the problems, what are the priorities, and these then could be brought into mechanisms like registries, for example, to provide access, even if it's not yet in the schedule of benefit, because that always takes time, and everybody understands that.
Right. And just to maybe build on that, so if you take a treatment that has gone through a clinical trial in, just give an example, the U.S. through the Food and Drug Administration, as an outsider looking in, how transferable is that to, for example, a Health Canada approval?
So that is actually very well made here in Canada, I have to say. So if there is FDA approval and other approvals around the world, for example, then there would be documentation which is then received by Health Canada. And I have to say, having experience with other countries as well, Health Canada is very nimble and very quick then, for example, to review these documentation and to approve it. However, if something is approved, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's then available, because still some institution or some authority still has to fund the access, for example, because there's obviously a product involved, there's obviously some physicians' work involved, there's some hospital infrastructure involved, for example, so that needs to be paid. So Health Canada approval is very good, actually. It's a very good and quick and nimble process. But the process afterwards, how to fund it or how to get access in some way, that's something a lot of other jurisdictions are struggling with as well. Right. Ontario, Canada is not unique in that.
So if I think about it, sort of that's a very helpful perspective. So you really, from a patient access perspective, there's really two gates. There's the first gate, which is the regulatory approval that it's safe to use here in Canada, and what you're saying is that the gate that is most challenging, probably everywhere, is how do we pay for it? How do we resource it? And that's that's really helpful, because I think sometimes in the discussion, those for people that are not in the system, those two gates can often get mixed up.
Yeah.
Right. And we talk a lot about regulatory efficiency, and that's a good global perspective. Rebecca, when we think about the broader sector, one of the things I know you have always been an advocate of is ensuring that we as an isotope sector here in Canada do a better job of telling our story. And that as the means to an end of ensuring, let me say, greater levels of support and engagement. If we were sitting here 10 years from now, and why don't we get together 10 years from now, and we'll get together many times before then. But if you look ahead to where we'll be in, let's say, 2034, 2035, what picture would you paint for people? Where do you think we can be 10 years from now?
Well, I think I like to be an optimist, and I would like to see that in 10 years' time, the field of radiotheranostics is not will no longer be operated as a radiation field or as a drug. There will be a mechanism that blends together the best of delivering this type of therapies and approving this type of therapies that would allow newer drugs that have proven efficacy to get to the patient much faster than we are able to do so now.
Right.
So I think from a policy perspective, I hope to see a different type of structure that leverage the best of other modalities to allow us to move forward quicker. I expect to see a lot more radiopharmaceuticals across all the solid tumors and hematological malignancies for adults and children. Not every cancer would require this type of treatment, but it has a very strong potential as personalized medicine, and I would like to see all of these being identified, discovered, and found its way into clinical practice. The third piece is in the healthcare delivery sector. Again, we are surgical department, medical oncology, radiation oncology department, and we're all friends and talk to each other. But the healthcare structure is in those buckets. And I would like to see that is a lot more efficient, and we have the infrastructure to deliver the radiotheranostics efficiently and reach the patients, whether they are here or in Thunder Bay or Newfoundland, with equal ease wherever it's needed.
Yeah, because access to care is also really critical. Last question to you, Patrick. So when I look at your biographies and what you do, often, and I see this with a lot of individuals that we get to engage with who have your professional expertise, often see an organization like UHN aligned with University of Toronto, for example. How should we think about that relationship? Because you're really wearing two hats in many cases. So how in layman's terms should we think about that relationship between a post-secondary institution and then a healthcare delivery organization?
I think this is a very important collaboration, because at the university level there is obviously the teaching of new generations coming into this field. For example,
right.
There is also basic sciences, which are partly done at the hospitals as well. But this is where a lot of basic science information comes from, which is then translated into clinical trials and hopefully at some point, as Rebecca said, into clinical routine, for example. So this is really the pathway, how I see it, so that there is teaching, motivating the next generation, doing basic sciences at the university level in collaboration with the hospitals, and then transferring it into the hospitals and into clinical routine to get access or give access to those therapies. Doesn't necessarily need to be that it's only from the industry being brought to the hospitals. It can be actually coming out of the universities as well, where the compounds are being designed and then being tested in preclinical trials as well. So this is how I see this alignment as like kind of a pathway from the molecule actually then to the patient.
Well, that's really helpful, because in some of the previous podcasts, we've talked a lot about how to build the talent pool as well. This is obviously a very technical field. The way of growing this in Canada is by developing that talent pool, right? It's all in the people. Well, I want to thank you both for not only being here today, but for everything that you do. It matters. It makes an important difference. And for your leadership and your advocacy. Obviously, one of the reasons why we're doing this podcast is to reach out to people and tell our story. And I know you have other avenues which you do that through your own podcast, and I encourage people to listen to those. They're very informative. But for those listeners that are joining, we are encouraging them to share this on their social media, get this message out, because while there's many great things we can do together, we're only going to realize that opportunity if people realize that it's there and direct people together. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having us.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Patrick.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Canadian Nuclear Isotope Council Isotopes for Hope podcast with James Sconiak. Please share this podcast and follow us to stay in the loop. To learn more, please visit our website at canadianisotopes.ca.